All right. And you were not here last week either. That's right. Okay, so we got to catch ourselves up. Well, we're not going to go over last week. Welcome back to our fourth class in the series. We're finishing up our discussion of Tselem Elokim, Tikkun Olam, making ourselves stable, what Breshit has to say to us about living a full human life. And we've been using the imagery all along of the vertical axis and the horizontal axis in terms of relationships with God and others, and how Breshit teaches us to balance and manage both axes at the same time. Last week we looked at the story of Cain and Hevel. And we opened by asking really what we thought Cain and Hevel, the story, was fundamentally about. We entertained the possibility that it was primarily a story, I think you actually said the end conclusion, right? But somebody had said, well, it's really a story about the breakdown of ethical relationships. And you had said, well, no, it really seems to be like a breakdown or primarily Cain reaching out to God and a failure being there. In the end, we didn't have to choose. And we argued that, in essence, the story is framed by Cain's desire to reach out to God, not knowing quite how. He is the first to offer a korban, a mincha, and we suggested that part of his failure was that he was establishing a relationship with God based on what he perceived to be God's need, which are really his own needs. And implicit in asking God for, or in offering the mincha, seems to be a request for perhaps more rain, perhaps greater crops in the future, and so there is a give and take, which he assumes is part of the relationship with God. Backing track for a moment, we had said that part of what was made ambiguous in Parak Aleph, with which we began, was whether or not it's even up to human beings to strengthen, actualize, create, stabilize the relationship with God, or, like we had said in the beginning, are we in relationship with God by virtue of being created b'tselem Elokim? Cain seems to go for the more active stance, which in and of itself doesn't seem to be the problem, but there seems to be an issue with his assumptions going into that reaching out. More importantly, we said that further on in the story, when God does not accept his korban, I made the suggestion that in fact there is no real substance to the rejection. It's not because he did something wrong in his korban, right, notwithstanding what I just said about his desire for give and take. And God responds with rejection, but more importantly, after Cain registers his emotions all over his face, and God turns to him and says, like, why? You know, why are you going crazy? Lama charalach, v'lama naflu panecha? Why are you taking it so to heart? His message to Cain at that moment is really, I'm in relationship with you. If what you were doing was trying to reach out, here we are talking. I'm here. I'm with you. I'm still engaged with you. Don't see, right, or don't elide, as we said, your sense of worth with that thing you did, such that you feel as if the whole gig is up between the two of us. It's not. I'm right here. I'm talking to you. And instead of Cain responding with dialogue, he responds by murdering his brother. And so, as we said, the horizontal, the ethical, gets caught up in that frustrated relationship that Cain has with God, but really with himself, right? Really with his mistaking his output with his being. So we have the three, right? Self, God, and other. And this week we're going to see one more example, probably, well, arguably less dramatic than the murder of Hevel, but more dramatic in certain senses because it involves the totality of this group in Parak Yud Aleph in chapter 11, as well as because it's really the last of the universal stories. And after chapter 11, we launch into the birth of Avraham, or more importantly, the introduction of Avraham into the scene, and the entire book of Breshit shifts towards a particularistic narrative, which I want to suggest in a certain way is responding to some of the problems that have played themselves out in chapters 1 through 11. Meaning, in the universal stories we have seen now in one example, soon in a second example, and there are many others, where people are trying through this kind of universal hands-off lens to figure out how to be in relationship with each other, themselves, and God. It doesn't really work, as we'll see very clearly in this chapter. And in Parak Yud Bet, God communicates with people and intervenes with people in a whole different pattern and a whole different scheme, and that's That's Abraham, and that's eventually going to be the story of the Jewish people. So Perek Yud Aleph is very important to see really almost the climax, perhaps the crescendo of some of these impulses, or to answer the question, why was this the story that really totally shifted the scene? Okay, so we have here in the source packet, there's only 2 sources at the very end that have to do with Migdal Bavel. On your sheet, it's starting on page 12. At the bottom, source 18 is the psukim, and there are only 9 of them. And then we have a Rashi, which we'll get to afterwards, after which we have some extra sources, which we may or may not read directly. We're going to bring them in to sort of broaden our conversation about this balance. Okay, so the tricky thing about reading Migdal Bavel is, as we said in the beginning, we're familiar with the story, and so we're struck with the same challenge of reading familiar stories in new ways. I also would love to be able to read the story naively and then come back and read it in a more problematic way, but you encounter some of the problems right away that it's nearly impossible to even offer that stab at a naive reading. But if I were to ask you, same as I did last week with Cain and Hevel, what's your assumption based on your memory of Migdal Bavel? Is this fundamentally a story about the breakdown of the ethical, or fundamentally a story of the breakdown of the religious? What would you say? More the religious. Why?
Because the whole purpose was to build a tower to God.
Okay. And so your assumption about that is, what were they trying to do?
Approach God to be better than God.
Okay, good. To approach God, to be better than God. You're definitely influenced by Rashi's reading, which we're going to see inside, and it's very compelling. This is, and you're right, the vertical, quite literally in this story, it seems like it's really about them versus God. Okay? Anyone have a different take? Just based on memory. We'll see. We're going to introduce lots of possibilities once we see it inside, but Migdal Bavel, what comes to mind?
It's a pretty social story. It's about people wanting to work together. I mean, in some ways, very admirably, figuring that if they all work together, they can accomplish this great thing. And if they don't somehow centralize themselves around this object,
Something will happen to
they'll
them.
not cohere
Right. Okay.
socially. So actually, it seems to me that the God part only comes in when God steps in. Like, it doesn't seem that that's what it's about at first.
Okay.
And you almost are influenced, maybe the social organization isn't so great because this brick thing comes up later. Like, building bricks doesn't have good associations in the Torah.
Okay, good. So Wendy's pointing out, something very important, which is, you're right, and we're going to see again more in depth, that it seems like this tower has a lot to do with God, perhaps. But Wendy's also right that in the opening scene, before we get to God's response, and the story really evenly breaks down into, the narrative and then God's response, and they provide different sorts of clues as to what is really going on here. But in the beginning, the story seems to be really about the people and how they are interacting with each other. God is sort of in the shadows. And so, of course, what we're going to see, I hope, is that really the two are intimately connected, and you can't actually talk about the story with one or the other. So let's see how this plays out. Of course, let's just remind ourselves, Migdal Bavel, we know what it comes just before, but it also comes after the story of the flood. And people like to talk about, Dor HaMabul versus Dor HaHaflaga, the generation of the flood versus the generation which builds the tower, as really kind of opposite types of generations. And of course, the one being after, we could suggest perhaps they've learned from their mistakes. They have their own, but perhaps they've learned from the mistakes of the Mabul. The Mabul has characterized that generation as total social chaos, right? No regard for norms, for laws. The word Hamas appears several times in the beginning of the story, which seems to be associated with robbery and theft and perhaps even murder, and we know there's also a breakdown in the sexual realm according to the Midrashim. So there seems to be a total disregard for social cohesion, for social order in the Mabul, and of course even the imagery of the flood and the world being undone, and even when it comes to the level of the animals and their interactions with each other, it's matched, right? Their behavior is matched by the undoing and the punishment. And then you come to the story of Migdal Bavel, and it couldn't be more different. So let's read actually in the Hebrew. Pasuk Aleph. Vayhi chol haaretz safa echat udevarim achadim. Great opening, really hard to translate. Let's not look at the English. And it was that the whole land, right? Or, and aretz is an important word for us from Perek. Okay, from Perek Aleph, Adama was really important in Perek Bet. The whole of the aretz, which we don't really know if it means that it's describing all of humanity or everyone in this one area, doesn't really matter. The impression seems to be it's the kol. This is everything. This is the only story worth telling now about humanity. They were all one safa, one language. And now try to translate Devarim Achadim. It's sort of impossible in English to be literal about the translation. Davar Achad, I could say one word, one thing. What happens when you make Achad plural? Devarim Achadim. You can't have one's words, right? So there's something about the words, the things they said, or perhaps the things they were engaged in, although it feels linguistic from Safa Achad, was both one and plural at the same time. Go ahead.
It just shouts ominously, they were one in every sense.
Okay.
There were no different ideas, there was no different language. For good or for bad, they were extremely unified.
Good. Okay.
We don't know what that means.
And we don't know, but we all know because we know the end of the story. But you're totally right that in the opening pasuk, right, Echad jumps out at you in two different forms, right? And we know the Echad from Perek Aleph, and that's really what we've been tracing this whole time, is how human beings negotiate. That's that reality of being Echad, right? Remember class 2 when we looked at Rashi on Lo Tov Heyot Hadam Levado, right? There's something problematic about the oneness, the singularity. So this is a story about one. The question is it good or bad? So the unity, when we contrast it with the Mabul, seems to be wholly good. But there's something too much about this Achad already. Okay, Safa Achad, but why Devarim Achadim? Right? There are those who also suggest that it's not just that they're overly unified, but they are all actually saying the same thing. There is, I don't see here an overt sense that they're not allowing other speeches, but who is the they anyhow? Right? It's kol haaretz, it's everybody. It seems to be internally regulated, but there is a totalitarian kind of oneness which already is making Malka nervous, right? That seems already, it's beyond. Okay, but we could say if we didn't have all that baggage, all it's saying is that people were together, they were speaking the same language.
So Safa Achat might be the actual language that they're speaking.
Right.
There's one primeval language.
Right.
And Dvarim, closer to Dibur, is that they're all, the substance of what they're saying is the same thing.
Right, which are totally different, right? The first is, and of course, good. I mean, we know that this one way of reading the story is also that this is an ideological tale of how, right, people have multiple languages. So the way the story is being told here is it starts out as one, and by the end, 9 psukim later, there's many, many languages. So the first thing is noticing that at first, like you said, there was a primeval language, but the second comment has nothing to do with the language they were speaking. It has to do with what they were saying, the substance of their ideas.
So, okay, one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's this book, Sapiens. Have you read Sapiens?
Yeah.
Right? Harari, Yuval Noah Harari is like a social anthropology of humankind.
Okay.
And he posits, I don't know exactly how he knows this, but that what made Homo sapiens actually triumph over the other possibilities in the Homo spectrum was that they actually could create myths. So you could, under this heading, assume that they had a common myth.
Mm-hmm.
And the point was that that's not an easy, like we take that as axiomatic, like people, you do that, they have organizing stories that create communities, but the ability to commit yourself to a story, a big story that is beyond you and unifies you to collective could get you to commit to doing stuff and not just looking out for your own self and that's how this one group can beat out the Neanderthals, even though they were more physically adept. Like, they should have beaten us.
The narrative.
The ability to unite around a common narrative, seemed to have had an evolutionary adaptive advantage that it was attached to it that allowed Homo sapiens to triumph even over other Homo geniuses,
Yes,
whatever, that could have physically ought to have won.
Okay, if I understood what you just said, right, what's then interesting in this story is that despite that, right, or maybe in an evolutionary sense they were successful, but then there's this intervention that is either...
Yeah, so why would God, that's the thing that makes human beings be most Tzelem Elohim-like, because they can imagine communities in a way that's not just literal and bodily, but they then might exceed their own sense.
Okay, good.
Of proper boundaries.
Okay, good. Beautiful. Okay, so keeping that in mind, yes. Pasuk bet. Vahi benos'am mikedem, vayimseu bik'a be'eretz shinar, vayeshvu sham. Now our students love this pasuk because Dr. Shinar, right? But when they traveled from the east, okay, which of course is an important signifier in Breshit, because east was the direction, right, that they traveled out of Gan Eden. It's also the direction, right, that Cain travels further. Here they're coming from the east, so it's a little bit different, but that word is certainly, right, a subtle reminder of past problems. Exile, yes.
So that assumes they're going west.
Okay, they're going west, but instead of saying they're going west, they're going from east. Right, so if you were anticipating that this was perhaps a wonderful story, they are leaving that direction, right? So they're maybe going back to Gan Eden or something like that, right? But it's not. So they find a valley in this land and they settle there, okay? So again, reading, perhaps we can do it for 2 psukim naively. They're unified, they travel, they settle. They seem to be doing what Perek Aleph wanted them to do, which was, right? We don't hear population growth exactly, but, right, and notice that, we don't hear population growth, but we see that they are settling the land. Vayomru ish el re'ehu, hava nilvana levenim, v'nisrefa l'srefa, that's the end of what they say, v'tihi lahem halevena le'aven, v'hachemer haya lahem lachomer. I'll read one more pasuk. Vayomru, hava nivna lanu ir umigdal v'rosho b'shamayim v'na'aseh lanu shem pen nafutz al pnei chol haaretz. Okay, and that's the end of the part where the people are doing what they're doing, and afterwards we move into God's response. So let's milk it for whatever it's worth. 2 psukim where people speak to each other. Now this is not nothing. This is the first time that we actually hear many people speaking to each other. This is the first Vayomru in Breshit. Up until now, any conversation that's transpired has been either between God and small bits of conversation between people. Now this is everyone. Everyone's saying to Re'ehu. It's also the first time we have that concept of a friend, a relation that's not a blood relative. Sounds positive, perhaps. Let's make bricks. Hava nilvana levenim. Now, Wendy already reminded us that bricks have problematic associations in Tanakh. The word hava should also bring up associations. Does it? Hava nilvana levenim. Okay, hava nilchak malo. Okay, which is from here. Okay, right? But
Well, no, that's
I'm sorry. Right.
That's the Egyptians wanting to...
Correct. Sorry, right? Hava nilchak malo, and that's really from a sinister place. Anything else that Hava brings up for you, either directly or by Hava, is a sense of let us do. So Hava also can mean give me, right? Havali, give me, right? When Rachel demands, or when Yaakov demands Rachel. But I'm also thinking, yes, in Perek Aleph, when God, remember in Perek Aleph, when God creates human beings, it's not the word Hava, but it's the word Na'aseh. Let us do this. Now, human beings here are really speaking in a kind of God language. Let us, and what do they want to do? Let's make bricks. This is a new invention. They were living in the valley. There seemed to not have been, right, there wasn't clay in the way that they could build where they had in other places. They want to create bricks. Let's burn them hard, and they'll be like stone for us. We don't have stones in the valley, so we're going to make them. We're going to invent this thing. They're acting like God. So again, the naive or positive read is, well, this all sounds good. because they are actualizing what God had asked them to be, an extension of God, and to be creators, co-creators, right? The God piece is missing here, as we noticed, right? They're speaking only to each other, and there's no consultation, and there is no mention yet of God at all. But let's build for ourselves these bricks. Let's be these creators. And then they say in Pasuk Daled, which is really interesting, they have the idea of building the bricks before they have the idea of what they want to build. Okay, which I find to be very unsettling. There's something, right, their desire to build and make and invent is more than even the functional needs that they have, if in fact Pasuk Daled is describing a functional need. But what do they want to do? They want to build lanu, for ourselves, a city, and a tower whose head will be in the sky, or really will be very tall, and we will make for ourselves lanu, a name, lest we be scattered al pnei kol haaretz. Now I want to just bring something in before we look at the pasuk. I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times Magazine this past Shabbat, but it was called the New York issue, but the only thing that was discussed in the entirety of the magazine was skyscrapers. It was all about this phenomenon of like the over 800 feet, and there was an article about people who are living above 800 feet and trying to figure out like what's that about for them and what are they trying to seek. And I couldn't stop thinking about Migdal Bavel. This idea of, and people talked about wanting to be in nature when they're so high up because they're so removed from people. And yet it's a creation of human beings and trying to really surpass and go beyond and reconnect perhaps in the most positive way. But of course, other articles were about all the people who have died in the creation, of all these skyscrapers, right? And the ethical component which the people who are living high up are certainly not thinking about when they're in their apartments. So what is it? What are they trying to do? There's lots of things in Pasuk Daled. What do you read? What is the primary motivator? Or what are the possibilities? And are they positive, are they negative? What's wrong with building a city?
Well, it sounds like they're trying to negate what God told them to do, which was to scatter across the world, lest we do what he wants us to do, which is to scatter.
Okay, good. So one of the Parshanim says that's really the problem, because if you focus on the end of Pasuk Daled, what they're concerned about is exactly what God told them to do. It wasn't the word lafutz, but it was, right, pru'ervu milu et haaretz. The objective was not for you to stay in one place. And I always push my students to think about, well, why not? Why is that the problem? What's that about for them, first of all? Why don't they want to be scattered? What is comforting for them in staying in one place? Or what makes them nervous about being spread out, right? Is it a lack of cohesion? Is it they feel unsafe, right? Is this pragmatic? What is it about the divine command in Parak Aleph, which is you must do this, and what is it about their anxiety that they want to stay together?
Or is it a different nakuta, which is what I was getting at, which was don't want to do what he's telling us to do, whatever the reason may be, lest we fulfill his mandate.
Okay, now what's interesting about what you're saying, okay, is that it's almost like it comes down to Parak Gimel in a certain sense, meaning it's not that they were so interested in eating that fruit, they didn't want to do or they couldn't do because God told them to do that, they wanted to specifically, okay? Interesting. But what's strange about that reading, Malka, is that, right, unless it's so encoded in their sense of self, right, God's not mentioned, and people have not spoken to God in quite some time by the time we get to Yud Aleph, right?
Why would it say, lest we be scattered? Where'd that come from? Let's make a city so we'll live together, because it's better.
But then it's not pen, that's really like, so we won't be.
Exactly.
No, you're reading it even stronger, right? That it's not, well,
it's really
so we can kind of make sure, so maybe we won't, maybe we will. You're saying, no, we're doing this so that we won't, despite.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would say, we can build a city, and then we can all stay together that way, because it's better.
Because otherwise we have to be hunter-gatherers and we're always exposed to the elements. We have to kind of live with the wild, which we know is sort of difficult, really untenable. It's very confusing, and it's almost as though God wants them to always be in a state of vulnerability and mercy.
Okay, which is what we talked about a few weeks ago, right, in Parak Aleph, when we were talking about their their imperative to take control of the natural environment. And right, you were talking specifically about, right.
So now they're taking control, but there's like too much control.
Okay, but notice, by the way, who's missing, and this is also interesting post-Mabul, and all the students pick up on this. There's no animals in this story, right? It's like the whole world is about, there's them, and then there's this natural material that they are going to turn around for their purposes. God is there, but God is really only there, right, implicitly. And they are not taking control of, you're saying they're running away from that, and they actually don't want to deal with that, right? And it's too precarious and it's too difficult, and so let's just stay right here and self-protect and create for ourselves a way of life that we don't have to encounter all of those dangerous elements, animals included. Well, what about the first part? What about the first or the second part? Is the ear, like the way you're reading it, that's just what we need to do in order to avoid scattering or take care of ourselves? Migdal v'rosho b'shamayim, that's of course where Rashi is going to come in, and that, right, is more of a perhaps reaching, or as you said, attacking or going against, right? It could be
inspiring technological achievement that gets people to rally around because they're looking for the transcendent in their lives. Like it.
The positive reading. Okay, can you embellish that a little bit? Like, let's say we put Rashi aside for a moment. They're trying to achieve a sense of transcendence. Okay, support that, because I'm so interested in that, but I don't see it in this pasuk.
Well, so here are human beings that probably stumble upon this accident where some mud was left outside and they suddenly realize they can do something with it. Like just like all the way these major discoveries happened in primeval times, right? And they go, wow, this happened. And so there's a way for us to use nature or actually augment it with fire. Fire's important. The fire shows up. Right? And so that's the...
But fire doesn't show up, right? There's so much about human prowess here.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
And suddenly they realize that they can harness all of this know-how. Mm-hmm. Now, just last night we were picking up our daughter from the airport and we were listening to NPR, and there was an article. There was a report about brickmaking in Nepal, and actually how incredibly taxing and time-consuming, and how much you need to get everybody involved in the whole family to get this done, which has led to a tremendous child labor problem in Nepal, where families are basically enslaving their kids because it's piecework. You get paid by the brick, and it's only like a cent. Right, so there is an implicit slavery thing that's
contained in that Ish over Ehu, or is implied.
And then, of course, that it gets augmented because the Levanim shows up again in the Exodus story as a tool of slavery. So there's something here. They can't seem to negotiate the balance between using technology to better human life and using technology to dehumanize others. I like it seems like it could be great, but somehow the way these stories go, if there's safa achat, that means there's no respect for any individual within the safa achat.
Right. I want to pick up on what you just said. I mean, technology is so important in this story, and I think you're right that Breshit has a real ambiguity about the role of technology. Even if you go back to, the introduction of a city, which is with Cain, right? After Cain receives his punishment and he is cast off as a wanderer, the very next thing he does is actually build a city, right? And there's that curious phrase, "Vayhi bone'ir," right? The Ramban says, why didn't it just say he built it? Well, because it's ongoing. That's Cain. He's a delayed construction project. He's never going to be successful because but his children end up being also responsible for the introduction of metalwork and other pieces of technology, and that is an unabashed good thing, but it's associated with the line of Cain, right? And then here too, we see people who are, as you said, really forging ahead and creating new possibilities for human existence. And if we look at Parak Aleph as really trying to create dignity for human beings, for human life, and avail us of the possibilities of what we can create, and then at the same time, we're really underneath the surface is this implied erasure of ethical responsibility. And so it seems like, right?
It seems
Go ahead.
Like, balance is a common theme throughout Tanakh of God empowering people to be co-creationists, but let's not forget me altogether. That or your character needs a balance. My place in your life needs a balance. And is it more than a coincidence that it's Shemayim, shame or Hashem, and then lest that we're going to build something to Shemayim, which implies God, Na'aseh shame, which is like Hashem, and lest we be scattered like he said we should be. There's that God-like words, references, which is saying, yeah, he meant for you to be creative, but let's not tilt the scale so much that God is forgotten.
But God has been forgotten. But like that would be the thing, because there's no indication that they have any.
That's the foreshadowing. They're saying, we forgot God, lest we be scattered like he said we should be. We're disregarding him. We're not looking. We're not connected to him. We don't care what he said.
Okay, let's pick up on this Migdal v'Rosho b'Shamayim and whether we're seeing here a hint towards God or reaching out, or you're arguing even more strongly he's really completely out of the picture, and Malka's sort of in the middle, which is saying it's hints, but you're really reading this as a direct hit on God, right? It's not that they are, right, to bring in a totally anachronistic term that this is sort of a secular society, right, which is so past God, right? This is a society that is actually working hard to, right, in the worst possible way, move further away and create really a sense of self-idolatry, of self-service, or, to use the terms we've been using all along, a very confused society, and really trying to figure out, again, how to negotiate these powers that they have, which we see actualized in the first few psukim, which was what God asked them to do, and yet how to manage that without overstepping, how to figure out, again, where they end and where God begins. Before we even look at God's response, let's take a look at Rashi. Okay, and the response is very important, right? This reminds me of the story of the Bnei Elohim and Bnot Adam, where when you read earlier in Breshit, you read what they do, it doesn't actually seem like so bad until you see God's response, and then you go back and you say, well, no, I have to look a little bit further to see what went wrong. Same thing here. But Rashi introduces a few interesting possibilities. Dvarim achadim. Ba'u be'etza achat. Ve'amru lo kol hemenu sheyibor lo et ha'elyonim na'aleh l'rakia v'na'aseh imo milchama. Rashi's quoting here from the Midrash, which actually has a slightly different formulation, but essentially saying what you had said in the beginning, Moshe, which is they came all together and they said be'etza achat, they had one scheme, they were unified, and they were unified against God. And they said, basically, it's not right that he has taken up for himself the upper regions. Let us go and wage war with him. Naseh imo milchama. Okay, he's really dvarim achadim, but Rashi seems to also be borrowing on Migdal v'Rosho b'Shamayim, that they're trying to reach heaven, right? It's not a skyscraper is not trying to reach heaven, it's trying to maybe defy gravity, or, right? But this is, let's actually try to get there. Okay, davar acher, al yichido shel olam. What are the dvarim achadim, the wordplay there on yachid and achad? What they were really saying all together, and Rashi leaves it very much without any detail. They were united, I would say, about or against, as the translation says, the real one. That one, God. What do they have against God? We don't know. And then the third possibility, davar acher, udvarim achadim. Amru, achat la'elef v'shesh me'ot chamishim v'shesh shanim, harakia mitmotet, keshem sh'asa b'mei hamabul. Bo'u v'na'aseh lo smuchot. This is like the least known of the Rashi, but I think the most compelling possibility. He says, they actually got together and did the math and imagined that what happened in the Mabul was a natural phenomenon. And it was a failure, remember, of day 2 of the establishment of the Rakia. Disregarding, clearly, the way the Torah tells it, which was that the Mabul was a response to their behavior and their social breakdown. This was a failure in the way that God created the Rakia. And so, Bo'u v'na'aseh lo smuchot. Let's go and create supports. Now this gets to be, right, not literally, But what they're really suggesting here is, on the one hand, they're taking charge. They're really doing the Perek Aleph mission. They are co-creators in the sense of even finishing or perfecting what God had created. Right? Mitzad Sheni, what they're basically saying is, A, we know better than God. B, we don't trust God. And C, there is no responsibility that we have on the natural environment. All we are the ones who are there to come and either harness it or fix it, but they don't realize that, in fact, their behavior has consequences for the earth. So Rashi here is really reading them in, I would say, clearly a very negative light. It can't be this, right, this sense of they're unified and they're working together. However, right, the theological and the ethical, Rashi is already presenting as being connected. What happens when God responds? Pasuk Hey. Vayered Hashem lirot et ha'ir v'et ha'migdal asher banu b'nei ha'adam. Now, of course, there's a sort of satire there, right? They're trying to build high, and then Ki'ilu God just kind of swoops down, right? And he comes to investigate, and God does this also in Sodom, to figure out what's really happening. But that word at the end of the pasuk is really significant. B'nei ha'adam, right? And the Midrash says, ha'adam, like the original Adam. There's something that's happening here, as strange as it may seem, an initial read, but not for us in this series. What's happening here is a fall back to what happened to Adam in Perek Gimel. These B'nei Ha'adam. They see themselves as being able to take over, take charge, reach up. Who are they? They are B'nei Ha'adam.
This is the next iteration of expulsion, right?
This is the next iteration of expulsion, right? It's an expulsion of a totally different kind. It's almost like it's...
For seizing also, like some forbidden power, and the same kind of language, like better kick him out now, because then they'll take Eitz Chaim.
Okay.
And here, better kick him now, because somehow they'll exceed Lo Yibatzer Mehem Kol Asher Yazmu Lasot.
Okay, good. So what Wendy's reminding us of course, is that, remember, at the end of Perek Gimel, after they receive their punishment, which if you read it in the same way, right, but then again, you're reading Perek Gimel as a theological sin, okay, which is what they wanted to suggest in the beginning and not what you wanted to suggest, right? But that what's happening here is that God is now responding and saying, okay, this is the problem, this is the punishment, but there could be more. There could be more. Well, actually, there's no punishment yet, but they could do even more, so I need to get them out of here. In Gimel, it was out of Gan Eden. Here in Yud Aleph, and this is actually what the pasuk Wendy is referring to, is really complicated. When God says in pasuk Vav, "Heinam echad v'safa echad l'kulam v'zeh hachilam la'asot v'yata lo yibatzer mehem kol asher yazmu la'asot." Therefore, Hava nerda v'navla sham sfatam asher lo yishmu ish sfat reyehu. So God says something which I think, and my students often interpret it as, well, God's kind of scared, right? He feels like, well, they've accumulated all this power for themselves. They are speaking the same language. They are am echad, right? There's that echad, one pasuk, and this is what they have started to do. There's no stopping them. So therefore, what do I need to do? Pasuk Zayin, confuse all their languages. They won't be able to listen to each other and hear each other. Now, is that really what's going on? Is God feeling threatened in an actual kind of way? Is there a possibility here, right? That seems like a difficult story that the Bible would actually tell, that God is feeling like people are, right, in a position to overtake, if we take Rashi very literally, or in the way we've been discussing, that God actually recognizes in this moment that there's something they are doing here which is so dangerous. It's not like before where it was needed to be stopped, or God needed to say to Cain, where is your brother? You need to recognize that the ethical is implied here. This is God actually saying, no, this is too much for them to even contain. Now, what is the too much? That's what I'm wondering. What does God actually respond to when he says, if they continue in this way, there is no stopping them? What is the this? What is it? What is it that causes God to respond in this way? By the way, it's not a punishment. It is a sort of exile, because it's exile from collective understanding and unity, but there is no, the vayafetz Hashem otam, which is in Pasuk Ched, right, seems to come afterwards, right? The dispersal. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Then you'd have to say that what is it so bad about singularity of language and things that he's responding to, and maybe it's the mob mentality, that I'm going to put a religious spin on it, is going to lead, if you're going to undermine God and build a big tower to reach him and disregard what he says, if there's only one language, everyone is going to have the same narrative, and there won't be anyone who has the moral sense to say where we're going isn't good.
I don't follow. Can you say that
There's
again?
only one language.
And it clearly is the wrong one. But somehow they've cohered around a wrong idea.
And they are trying to transcend God. Then there won't be someone to step forward to say, we are going in the wrong direction.
There's no counter voice, right? And if they've managed this far to accomplish it, right?
But by creating separate languages, there's no communication. So what God has done is basically broken up this society and saying you can no longer talk to each other.
Okay. And if we take that literally, that seems to be like too much, right? It's not the introduction of another possibility. It's actually creating now a society that can't function.
There is no society.
Right? And if you look at Pasuk Chet, right? Thank you, right? And God spreads them out, which is the second thing that happens. The first thing that happens is the introduction of multiple languages. Then the Vayafet, which they had said, Pen Nafutz. So God says, you don't want to be, right, spread out. I'm doing it for you. Vayachtelu livnot ha'ir. That's the postscript that they stopped building the city, right? That's actually the biggest clue that it wasn't the city itself that was the problem, or the Migdal for that matter, which doesn't even get mentioned, right? So it's not that God was going back to the anxiety of Pasuk Vav. It's not that God was actually afraid that they were going to reach him and overtake, right? And he wasn't saying we must stop this building project. The building project was the last thing to get mentioned, that stopped on its own because they could no longer do the work that they were doing. That's the logistical answer. Or B, their desire to build this migdal or this ir was contingent on the kind of society that they had created, which was a univocal kind of society, and that even that concept of wanting to do that dissipates once there is, and now I'm changing the notion a little bit, it's not that they couldn't understand each other, but now there was multiplicity. Now there was pluralism, right? And I wanted to just say, I meant to say this in the beginning, I think this story is doubly challenging for us to read because the consequence, if we read this as a sin and punishment, the consequence is pluralism, which we, in many senses, are embracing. So it's hard for us to read this as, well, God punished them by saying, all right, well, now you're going to have to live with all your differences. Right? That's something. Go ahead.
God saying pluralism is the way to go.
Okay, but then you don't read it as it's not a punishment. Pluralism is not the punishment, right? It's what they weren't getting on their own. It's what they weren't able to
The message
correct.
he's giving them is pluralism. I don't think it means every single person has their own language. There were groups
Right.
now of people who spoke Semitic, and pluralism is the way to go, and that's why God had to come down, because they were mono, not multi.
Okay, so we are moving in this direction anyhow. I want to just ground it in two sources. This is on the extra sheet, which you have. If you haven't seen, you should know both of these ideas. There's a piece here from Yeshayahu Leibovich and a piece from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and they really go together. Let's look at the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer first, which is the second source. We'll read it in English. Rabbi Pinchas said, "There were no stones there wherewith to build the city and the tower." What did they do? They baked bricks and burnt them like a builder would do, until they built it 7 miles high, and it had ascents on its east and west. The laborers who took up the bricks went up on the eastern ascent, and those who descended went down on the western descent. If a man fell and died, they paid no heed to him. But if a brick fell, they sat down and wept, and said, "Woe is us! When will another one come in its stead?" That's a very kind of graphic example of what we ourselves were noting in the story, which was they had total disregard for human life, right? This is about, right, they were focused on this project that we could say, where I was interested in what you were suggesting, was perhaps about transcendence, something beyond them. It was beyond the individual, but it was in an extreme sense beyond the individual, such that they became more focused on that end and less focused to an extreme on human life.
Where's
Leibovich
that
says,
in the story?
it's not in the story. It's not in the story. Right.
Completely.
The Midrash is offering a possible, snapshot of what was happening in Psukim, Gimel, and Daled. But it shouldn't sound so foreign to us, meaning you're right, this is nowhere in the story, okay? And you don't take it or leave it. It's not about, right, saying this actually happened. But the Midrash is dramatizing for us what we saw through God's response. What was the anxiety? And this was answering the question. Why did God say they must be stopped? Not because they would overtake the heavens. They must be stopped because they are losing that primary, essential, critical view, which is that every human being has infinite value. Right? In their quest to amplify the aspect of Tselem Elokim, which was the creative and the mastery over nature and the subjugation of the elements and their ability to create a more dignified lifestyle for themselves, they forgot the other piece, right? Which was each human being, each person in front of them has an infinite value. Now,
when you have all these different languages, I'm thinking in terms of history, and European history perhaps, but all the different tribes or countries fought against each other because they couldn't talk to each other.
right?
And that's what God ended up doing. He's creating different languages so people can't communicate. They can't, if they have differences, they have to fight. There's no way of talking.
Correct, right. And this is, and Leibovich is going to say essentially what you suggested, which is on the one hand, right, the regime or the situation which the beginning of Parak Aleph was depicting, whereby opposing opinions were not allowed, right? Whether we say it's because they all spoke the same language, they all promoted the same ideas, or more realistically we say because other ideas were not tolerated, right? That is a corrupt society. In response to that, God says, no, you have to learn to accommodate lots of possibilities. That's the only way that you'll be able to actualize the fullness of being a human being. But a totzah of that, a consequence of that is, of course, it's not simple to do. And living with difference and learning to live in and then let's not say pluralistic society, but let's say any society that has many differences did not lend itself automatically in any capacity, right, to people doing that in a way that respects the infinite value of every human being. But it creates the possibility.
And also, with all these splitting up of the people into different languages, there's nothing that prevents each of these from then trying to build its own city and tower within that particular language, within that particular group. So this doesn't solve the problem.
Right, but
It multiplies the problem,
right.
perhaps.
Right, except it doesn't, right? At least in the way that, again, I'm not reading the story as much historically as it is paradigmatic for what it means for human beings at this moment to come to a crisis point of, they got one piece, which was, okay, we can't kill each other, right? Pirkei Rabbi Elazar aside for a moment. We got, at least in explicit terms, we know we got to work together, we got to have concern for the other. It's not just me, right, and God, it's this group. But they too much to the point of, right, community without the individual, community without regard for each one in that group. And so Migdal Bavel is really, right, again, it's the climax point. You could say on some level it's much less dramatic than Cain and Abel, right? What happened? They tried to build something. God looked at them and says, this isn't going to work. Gives them lots of languages. Shalom Yisrael. They move on, right? There's no dramatic pronouncement. God never speaks to them directly, right? We've lost that. But in a certain sense, I think Migdal Bavel represents for us all of the tensions that have been, broiling this entire time since Parak Aleph. And it's all in good. The motives are there, right? I want to figure out how to live B'Tselem Elokim. I want to figure out how to live with an understanding that there are others in the world, right, that possess that same capacity. And I want to live in relationship with you, God. Right? Migdal Bavel is the final story where Breshit shows us really in a negative way, right? And it's sort of frustrating. Where are the positive stories? Tell me, how do I do this? Right? They teach us by way of the negative. Yeah.
Okay, so it's hard not to escape a reading of this as ideological, trying to explain a lot about how the world is at its roots, right? So why is it that we speak all these different languages? Like, didn't the world get created with Hebrew, right? Or how is it that we are so intransigently national and not coherent? Why is it? How is it that human beings manage to go from being so located in Africa and certain places in the ancient Near East to all over the place, right? So trying to take that fact of human history and how is it, by the way, that there's this one religion that we're promoting when there were all these other religions, and it seems that they were onto something too? And what would give the petach for actually making that okay for God to single out one group and allow them to have a special covenant when, right? And then, of course, you call the paradigmatic origin of all this Bavel, so that you can juxtapose it against what will be this huge power of Bavel later that will be real life, and it will have a particular national identity, and it will destroy the first Commonwealth. So underneath all of this is like a huge defense of just what seems to be the whacked out bad way the world is. And then I guess under the guise, because this is all preparatory for Avraham, under the guise of needing to create a pluralistic space so that in that one iteration of it, you'll have a religious way of life that will be better.
So thank you, okay? I would just say to that, yes, 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 and yes. Like, all those things are true, and what I'm suggesting here does not in any way sequester those readings, but it's saying, in addition to all of that, yes, there's a functional role, several functional roles that this story has in terms of explaining lots of what comes before and what comes after. And we didn't even notice, right before, I didn't show you, but right before the Migdal Bavel story is a whole parak of genealogies which describes people living all over the place with lots and lots of languages. The story that we just read is coming to explain, right, in a certain sense, what the chapter before lays out. But in addition to all of that, Parak Yud Aleph, what I'm suggesting in a sort of a heavily encoded way, is referring back to the thematics of all those earlier chapters. And so in addition to explaining how and why God goes to Avraham afterwards and moves, and like you said, right, this nation is now going to be the story, it's also teaching us in a certain way what has been left to open in all of human history, which continues to be our challenge. It's not like this ends and then once Avram comes on the scene and then when there's a brit, then we figure this all out. These are our challenges. We are trying to manage, right? And I'm not reading it, but if you just look at the Jonathan Haidt, which is source number 20, he calls it the ethic of autonomy, the ethic of community, and the ethic of divinity, which he introduces as a social psychologist, 3 different ways that societies actually manage their ethical compass. I would suggest that Breshit is asking us to do all 3 at the same time, right? We don't get to choose only the ethic of divinity, which, as he said, is based on the idea that people are temporary vessels within which a divine soul has been implanted, or to only focus on ourselves as autonomous individuals, but also to function within a community. And Breshit really spells out, right, what is at stake in each 3, and each, as we began, each is asking us all the time, right, in Judaism, and we need to learn how to upplay some of these elements. They're all pieces of what it means to be a religious, rooted, ethical human being. You can't have one without the other. You can't focus only on the vertical, you can't focus only on the horizontal, and both are what helps you focus on yourself. Thank you very much.